community. Today we are going to upload the conclusion, the second part of the story of Alphonse Parga, whom we thank once again for trusting us and sharing it with us. And it has undoubtedly become one of the most interesting and terrifying stories on this channel. If you just want to skip to the new part, go to the minute that will appear on the screen. If not, if you want to listen from the beginning, it will be a pleasure to spend the next while with you. This is Family Possession, and you're listening to Relatos of the Night. This happened in Guadalajara starting during the Christmas season of the now distant 1980. I was 8 years old back then, and I was lucky enough to be born into a financially well-off family. Until then, very loving. I didn't lack anything. My parents, both of them, were strictly Catholic, so they raised their 3 children the same way. Raul, my older brother, who was 15 at the time, I was in the middle, and Sophia, my little sister, who was just 4. Everything began for me on the Virgin's Day. Maybe it had been happening for a while, but that was the first day I noticed. The first day something strange happened to me. I was asleep when loud scratching sounds woke me up. They made me open my eyes. At first I didn't see anything strange in my room, but as my eyes got used to the darkness, a silhouette appeared next to my bed. Even though panic overwhelmed me at that moment. Because I was born into such a Catholic family, I think I had the strength to deny the existence of that thing in front of me. I reached in its direction and turned on my night lamp. And the light only slightly dispelled the shadows that surrounded that entity of darkness. But I could see it. It was my mother. You'd think seeing her would calm me down, but it was the complete opposite. Her mouth was moving abnormally fast, like she was praying, and her gaze, my God, her gaze was filled with endless madness, which I still remember to this day in my worst nightmares. She had her left hand on the wall, which she had already scratched the plaster off with just her fingers. "Mom?" I called her once, tucking myself in with my blanket. She was staring at me. That was not my mother. She couldn't be my mother. "Mom?" This time I screamed as tears rolled down my cheeks. Moments later, I heard hurried footsteps outside my room and the door opened quickly. It was my dad who, upon seeing the scene, let out a long sigh and quickly hugged my mom, taking her hand off the wall. As she lowered her arm, I saw a couple of drops of blood fall onto my nightstand. "Don't worry, son. Your mom is just sleepwalking," he told me before taking my mom out of the room. The following days went by normally. We were just days away from leaving for Christmas vacation at Disneyland. I still treasure the photos from that trip because it's our last memory as a happy family. By Christmas Eve, my brother had already been sick with bronchitis or something like that for about a week. So my mother let him skip going to Mass, which was our tradition. When we got home, we found Ruth and Lorenzo, who helped us with the gardening, very scared. They didn't let me hear what had really happened, but apparently it was something with Raul. At the time, I had no idea what happened. I only learned the truth 20 years later from my father. The thing is, when we arrived, the house was a mess. In fact, it was hard to believe that a sick 15-year-old boy could have done all that by himself. They had found Raul eating baby birds and squirrels, obviously raw. The celebration was canceled, and my sister and I were immediately sent to our grandparents' house. And my parents went with Raul to a private hospital. Our grandparents looked very worried, but they did their best to make us feel comfortable. We got home after January 6th. Apparently, Raul had fully recovered, and except for the absences of Ruth and Lorenzo, who quit a few days after the incident, life appeared to be returning to normal. They said my brother was back to normal. However, I noticed a radical change in his personality and his behavior. He had become violent and with erratic behavior, which became more pronounced as the day went on until nightfall. In fact, it wasn't unusual for him to hit my sister and me during those days, when until then, he had never laid a finger on us. And the same thing happened at school. In fact, it didn't take long for him to get expelled, just a few weeks later. I learned this years later, and the reason he was expelled is that during a fight with a classmate, my brother bit him on the arm and tore off a piece of it. Honestly, I don't want to dwell on this too much, and it's just that during that year, there were too many incidents involving my brother. With each passing month, he seemed to get worse, and no matter how many doctors my parents took him to, he didn't seem to get any better. They even took him to Mexico City, back then called the Federal District, to see a multitude of neurologists and psychiatrists, and he underwent every possible test. My family's life was turned upside down financially, and that's even though my dad's brothers took over the business. On quiet days, my brother would talk about female ghosts that would appear to him in the house. Although certainly, to me, what really terrified me was him. Even his physical appearance started to deteriorate. So 6 long years went by, and then there was a period of remission, a period when my brother went 6 months without any erratic or violent behavior. A neurologist from the Mayo Clinic, that's what they call a group of hospitals across the United States where you can find the best specialists that money can buy. He had given him a medication, and everything seemed to be calm. It was Christmas season 1987. Our family was preparing to host an unforgettable dinner. And well, that would happen, although not for the reasons we had planned. Many family friends came to the dinner, along with my uncles, my cousins, and this was very strange since ever since Raul had gotten sick, visits had been strictly forbidden. I remember very well that day. I was already fed up with my brother. Finally, at 14 years old, I felt like I was already an adult, and not only that, I resented my parents for their neglectful treatment. Thanks to Raul, the madman, he was the one who got all the attention. And yes, don't worry, I eventually hated my teenage self too. I made the decision not to pay any attention to him the whole evening, even though Sophia, my little 10-year-old sister, had been warning me about it since the morning. Raul is not okay. I remember she even told me with a seriousness on her face that was unusual for a girl her age. I replied with something I still regret. That crazy guy, he can go to hell. I could only watch as her eyes filled with tears, and I felt like garbage after that. Even now, just remembering it, I feel that way. Christmas Eve dinner went by peacefully. People laughed, talked, good wishes just kept flowing. I tried to avoid my sister's gaze. and not even the thought that my parents would finally buy me the Nintendo I'd asked for so much excited me anymore. A terrifying scream, followed by a horrible crash coming from the living room, shook us. When we ran to it, we saw an equally horrible scene. Luis, one of the older cousins, had been thrown from the first floor and lay badly injured on the marble table in the living room. He had fallen from a height of about 7 meters, but he was at least 5 meters away from where he would have been thrown. It was impossible. Luis was a huge guy. He weighed about 95 kilos, and the only one who was on that first floor was Raul. And the party was over. Emergency services were called, and Luis was taken to the hospital. He survived, but it took years before he could walk without a walker. Sometime later, he himself confirmed that, in fact, the one who had thrown him was Raul. That night, I doubt anyone at home slept. I know I didn't. I could hear footsteps all over the house, even along the outside walls. Occasionally, I heard someone trying to turn the knob on my door. In those moments, all I could do was huddle in the corner of my bed. For years, Raul's windows had security glass and his door locked from the outside. Although my father swore he had put Raul to bed and secured his room, I felt it, that he had found a way to escape, as if he were some kind of demon. And by that time, I didn't see him as my brother anymore, but as a monster. I know this was very unfair because I didn't even know what he was going through. Little by little, the constant state of alert that night wore me down until I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night only to realize with terror that my door was open. And all around the room, I could hear stifled giggles. Scared to death, I got up to close the door when I heard, "Little brother?" That was followed by a laugh. Maybe I only imagined what happened next because I was so scared. But I saw my brother come out from under the bed, crawling toward me like he was a cockroach. I rushed to my parents' room without thinking. I don't want to bore you with more stories like this, but my brother's sudden appearances, they even made my parents bring exorcists to the house to perform cleansings and all that, and none of this worked. My brother's moments of lucidity became more and more scarce, and his alter ego, if you want to call it that, was getting more and more violent. It was in October of '88 when the family made the decision to commit my brother to a mental institution permanently. I remember that I was coming home from school and I saw my brother sitting in the yard. He seemed calm and aware. That's why I think I felt the overwhelming need to apologize for all the things I had said about him. Raul would only be with us for the rest of the week, and then he would be transferred to a mental hospital in Spain. I sat next to him. Before I could start talking, he said to me, "Little brother, I'm sorry I wasn't a better brother to you." That made tears well up in my eyes and made me realize how unfair I had been to him. He continued, "Everything. It's all Mom's fault. Ever since she came to my room at night, she watched me, and since then I haven't felt like the same person. What she said hit me like a brick wall because that was exactly what had happened to me. The blood demons are consuming me. She somehow tolerates them, but I'm weak. That's why I do it. Her blood will consume us. Her blood will consume us. He said it again, each time faster and more agitated. Little brother, I want you to forgive me for everything, and for this. Shortly after, my brother slit his throat with a piece of rusty metal. And that was the beginning of my experience. However, I'm going to stop the story here. It's very hard for me to remember. Chaos erupted in the house within minutes of my brother's death. Within an hour, my uncles and dad surrounded the body. They kept repeating phrases of disbelief. Everyone felt the tension and pain. They were on edge. However, and if you want, call me crazy, but even with the shock I had suffered, I could see behind those faces of sadness a kind of almost morbid relief in all of them. My aunts and my mother were inside the house praying. Remember, my family had very strange customs, and for a few hours, my sister and I became almost invisible, to the point that they forgot I was there, just a few feet away from my brother's body. One of my uncles, a specialist doctor, begged my father to allow Raul's legal autopsy, because in the end, it was never known exactly what illness he had. And by law, in Mexico, in all cases of suicide, an autopsy must be performed. However, like the equivalent of about 50,000 pesos today was enough for the people at the public prosecutor's office to turn a blind eye. Obviously, I found this out sometime later. And the funeral was strange. I remember it was raining terribly all over Guadalajara, and only my family attended. My mother. It seemed like she had decided to cry and scream, everything she hadn't done when my brother killed himself. She screamed. Sometimes she scratched her face. Then she threw herself onto the muddy ground and rolled around. I might be judged for this, but it was a grotesque spectacle. I remember my sister wouldn't even get close. As the coffin was being lowered, I clearly remember how my mother hit the priest right in the face, and then she tore off the rosary she was wearing around her neck along with her blouse, and she threw herself into the grave. That was the last thing I saw when they took me out of there. That night, we slept at my grandparents' house while my mother was in the hospital, apparently due to a nervous breakdown. We were sitting at the table having dinners. Grandpa was reading a Reader's Digest magazine, and Grandma seemed upset. Stupidly, I happened to ask, Grandma, what is a blood devil? She stared at me and quickly got up and came toward me. She grabbed my arms and asked me, "Where did you hear that?" Afraid, I told her it was among the last things my brother said, and I also shared what I'd been told about my mom. Furious, she started yelling, knowing that witch would poison the family. Before she could go on, I saw Grandpa stand up and slap her. She never brought up the subject again. We thought the matter was settled for a while. My father sold the house and we moved closer to his brothers and grandparents. Even my mother seemed to be handling the grief as best as she could. In November of 1989, the whole family organized a family trip to the ranch they had in Mazamitla, where another event took place. Something that went on for too long, and although terrifying, I think it has nothing to do with this story, so I'll try to leave it out for now. However, when they returned from that trip, the whole family felt worn out. And since December was approaching again, I could even see the fear on my father's face. I'd be lying if I said everything restarted on the Day of the Virgin. I certainly don't remember exactly what day it was, but I do remember that night. I went downstairs for some water and found my mother standing in front of a wall in the living room, as if she were murmuring something. Seeing her, I was paralyzed. I remembered finding her at the foot of my bed years ago. I saw her and acted immediately. I ran toward the room, and I could almost swear she was right on my heels. I remember turning around and seeing her chasing me while walking backwards. I locked myself in and cried under the sheets as the door rattled. I felt, besides being scared, I was fed up. The first thing I would do in the morning would be to face my mother. I couldn't handle this situation any longer. And in fact, that morning, I remember coming downstairs very upset, and at the kitchen table were my sister and my dad. I told him what happened with my mom that night, and he gave me a strange look. "Are you going crazy too?" "Your mother couldn't sleep. She had a panic attack, so I had to take her to the emergency room, and we got back around 5 in the morning." My dad's words left me frozen. However, my sister also said something at that moment. "Something bad is happening, Dad?" "Sometimes I also see Mom walking in the yard at night." Look, kids, what happened with Raul has been especially hard for your mom. I know she has problems, but you shouldn't be afraid of her. However, despite my father's words, things at home were getting worse and worse, day by day, worse. Sometimes I saw my mom talking to herself or lighting candles for a straw idol whose origin I never knew. On December 22nd, that's when everything went to hell, definitely. I remember being asleep when I heard Sophie, my sister, let out a terrified scream. Without thinking, I grabbed a bat and, gathering my courage, ran to her room. There was my mother, naked. She was holding Sophie by the wrists. I hit her instinctively so she'd release my sister. I grabbed her, and together we ran to our grandparents' house. We couldn't go on anymore. You can imagine it was a scandal. My grandmother immediately filed a complaint against my mother, and even though my dad threatened to take us by force, the rest of the siblings agreed that until this situation was cleared up, it would be better for us to stay with our grandparents. My dad had no choice but to reluctantly accept it. Sophia especially never wanted to return to that house. That situation left a mark on her. I'll go ahead and tell you that. Unfortunately, that nightmarish version of my mother was the last one I saw. She died on the 28th of that month. The official story was that a thief broke into my parents' house and killed my mother and injured my father. He was in intensive care for almost a month after that. My mother's funeral was with a closed casket, and none of her family attended. I was left with many doubts, but my father took the secret to his grave, even though he confessed many things to me. He never mentioned this. When he left the hospital, my dad was never the same. He looked at himself. Always afraid. In fact, we went to live with my grandparents, and he became more and more religious. At some point, I hoped that, because of that, everything would get better, but at my grandmother's house, things went from bad to worse again. Sorry these writings are so long. I'm really trying to summarize as much as possible. And the problem is when you start to remember, when a bunch of details come flooding into your mind. In fact, there's still quite a lot left to tell. I've already bored many psychiatrists with my story. Do you know what it's like to live with a family that's borderline fanatical about Catholicism? It's at best something strange, but at worst it's terrifying. I say this because my grandparents weren't bad people, but after living with them 24 hours a day for years, you start to notice things about these kinds of people that aren't pleasant. When my mother died, it felt like my whole paternal family, and maybe we, her children, could finally breathe easy. For some reason, we all had this preconceived idea in our heads that my mother was the source of what had corrupted Raul, that she had brought misfortune to the family with Luis's accident. However, for some reason, my father, since my mother's death, seemed more uneasy, even terrified. My grandparents sent him to the mental sanatorium in Spain for over a year, the same one Raul was supposed to attend. That was a long time ago, and here I ask you to forgive me because the memories from when I lived at my grandparents' house, they start to become a bit hazy and confusing. It's also worth clarifying that back then, they took us to a psychiatrist who was a close friend of the family. He prescribed us some pills, and the only thing I remember about them is that they made me feel permanently confused. Without my father anymore, my grandparents made the decision to take us out of school temporarily with the excuse that we were emotionally unstable. And maybe it was true. Like I said, from those days I only remember the details very vaguely. Yes, we went to church daily and prayed often at home. I think that became a major part of our activities those months. And I started my third year of secondary school in September 1990 at a Catholic school. Grandma didn't allow Sophia or me to have visitors or to attend any kind of gathering. That kind grandmother we had known, her heart had hardened toward us. I remember my sister once told me, the thing is we have mom's blood. True or not, we were never able to prove it, although later on we realized that our grandparents kept a lot of secrets that for good reason they didn't want anyone to know. Before continuing, I want to stress something. At least I believe that everything that happened in my grandmother's house has nothing to do with what happened with Raul and my mother. In fact, you could say they're completely different. And also, just to clarify, my grandmother's house was very big, and there were entire sections where we were strictly forbidden to enter. I think it was around October of that year when strange things started happening at my grandmother's house. We were celebrating something that I honestly don't remember what it was, but it was nighttime. The adults were talking in the living room, and the cousins along with us were in an adjacent room. Then a scream broke the festive atmosphere. It was from Grandma, coming from the kitchen. Obviously, everyone rushed to see what had happened and found my grandfather pale and my grandmother lying on the floor. In her lap, Grandpa said they saw a thief in the yard. My uncles ran to check, but there was no sign that anyone had come in. Also, years later, since both of them had died, my father confessed to me that in a letter Grandma wrote to the sanatorium, she told him that they had seen my mother walking naked in her yard, smiling, and moving in an unnatural way. Why? As if she was mocking them. After this, Grandma became stricter with us. More hours of prayer, no going out. Something odd was happening in that house, but I didn't confirm it until late October. It was a rainy day. I went down the stairs. I had slept most of the afternoon, and I still felt a bit drowsy. When I got to the living room, I noticed that, with his back to me, there was what seemed to be the naked grandfather. Though his movements were strange, he silently turned and ran toward me. I don't remember seeing his face, nor do I even remember what he looked like. I lost consciousness, and it was precisely Grandpa and my sister who found me in the living room, wetting myself the next morning. Days later, when I finally got the courage to tell my sister what happened, she whispered in my ear very slowly, "I've seen him too, but don't think that's Grandpa, and only if you ever see the woman who smiles. Leave the house immediately and wait for someone to arrive." That's what I do. When my sister told me this, I remembered that in fact on several occasions when we arrived, we had found her alone on the porch. I remember that for some reason, I got pretty upset with her. You too, Sophia. Do you actually believe that stuff about ghosts and devils? That doesn't exist. Only God does. She looked at me very seriously, and she simply replied, "Brother, I only believe in what I see. I'm telling you this because I care, but you know exactly what you're doing." She kissed me on the forehead and went to her room. And at this point, I felt like I was going crazy, honestly. I was being careful around the house, trying not to be alone. And I saw the Black Grandpa 2 more times. That's what we started calling him. At a cousin's birthday party in December, I remember well that after the party, one of my older cousins, Raphael, asked us, "And you all? Have you seen the ghosts at Grandma's yet?" "Are you talking about Grandpa Negro?" I answered him instinctively, and the older cousins laughed and joked that he really looked like Grandpa. Then they told stories about why they thought the place was haunted and about what was hidden in the forbidden rooms. Despite what we talked about and the fact that we made fun of Grandpa Negro, the truth is that we were all terrified by the idea of running into him. The biggest problems with being a kid are not being taken seriously, not getting explanations, and most of all, not being believed when you talk about these things. I remember Grandma spanking us the first time we tried to mention the apparition in the house. But everything would change just a few months later. When we got back from shopping with Grandma, it was around 7 in the evening. We opened the door that led to the living room, and there was Grandpa Negro waiting for us. It was very dark, but we knew it was him. "Dear, is something wrong?" Grandma whispered, trying to take a step forward. And immediately my sister took her by the arm and told her firmly, "That's not Grandpa." That thing that was in the living room let out a laugh, so brazen that I couldn't tell if it was a whale. And my grandma fainted, and we focused on dragging her out of the house. When Grandpa arrived, Grandma had already regained consciousness. In the following days, we spent Christmas and New Year's with one of my uncles. Obviously, the celebrations wouldn't be at Grandma's house, but Sophia told me something very strange. She said once she drove by our grandparents' house with my aunt, she was able to see some figures in white robes inside the house. What I can say for sure is that my uncle's house had a completely different atmosphere. It was peaceful and didn't have so many religious idols hanging around. The grandparents, for obvious reasons, didn't feel comfortable with my uncle. They said they felt like they were intruding and couldn't wait to go back to their own home. But every time they were asked why they were waiting, they just said that the work wasn't finished yet. It was already mid-January 1991. The work still wasn't finished, but a problem had come up with some farmland, and the property titles that were in Grandpa's office were needed. The office was one of the forbidden areas of the house. At first, we all thought that Grandpa would say he would go get them, but he was firm in saying that he couldn't go in. He gave my uncle an old set of keys and told him where to find the titles. He warned him not to go snooping through his things, and my uncle replied, "I already know that you and my mom are witches." That, which was obviously a joke, didn't sit well with Grandpa, who quickly replied, "Well, it's thanks to these witches that you have everything you have." When we entered the house, my uncle apologized to me for making me go with him. This house has always terrified me. Actually, it terrifies everyone. He told me, but I replied that it wasn't a problem. The wing of the house, which only the grandparents had access to, was very strange. First, the hallways that connected to the main house or the permitted area had been blocked off with a wall. There was no way to access this place from inside the house. The only way was a heavy iron door that was covered by a tarp outside. The door itself was very strange, or at least that's how I remember it, even though I can't describe it. When you entered, this was just a hallway with doors on the left. Inside, you could vaguely see that all the windows had been bricked up, and Grandpa's office was the room at the end. This office was actually very normal. There was a bookshelf, a huge desk, and an old shotgun. Uncle found the papers and we hurried out. At that moment, before leaving, I don't know what he saw, but he grabbed my arm and without closing that place, he shouted at me to get out of the house quickly. In mid-March, that's when we finally returned to Grandma's house. Although, frankly, I didn't want to, but Sophia refused to consider leaving them alone. My uncle offered us a place to stay, and then he told me that time we went to the office, he saw that smiling woman with white hair. There in the hallway. Sophia called them Black Grandpa and White Grandma. That didn't amuse me anymore. The house often echoed with odd noises like doors opening or bathroom faucets turning on. And the best thing you could do, the only thing you could do was ignore them. Sometimes you could even hear someone praying inside the rooms. The grandparents acted as if nothing was happening, and they simply ignored us when we came to question them. We were in a terrible state of paranoia for a while, but when my father came back from the sanatorium, things at Grandma's house took a turn for the worse. Both my sister and I thought that with my father's return, we would get back a bit of that family life we had lost some time ago. But unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. I remember well when we went to pick him up at the airport. It was a pretty rainy day. Even my uncle and my grandfather, they believed that his flight wouldn't leave from Mexico City. However, to everyone's surprise, my dad arrived on time. The first image I have of my father was of a haggard Shan, with deep black circles under his eyes, thinning hair, and several kilos lighter. My dad hugged my sister and me together, but for some reason, I felt like something was missing from him. On the drive home, I remember Grandpa and my uncle talking with my dad, and he would only give them short, emotionless answers, which you would expect after being away for so long, far from his family. My sister asked me in a very low voice, "Did they steal my dad's soul?" And I immediately answered her, "Of course not. Don't be silly." However, that's exactly what I had been thinking. A dinner was held to celebrate my father's return, but not at my grandparents' house. I think most of my uncles were terrified of that house. Maybe it was their faith or respect for my grandparents, but they said nothing. At the end of that evening, the uncle we were staying with offered my father that both he and we could stay with him. He told him that he even already had the guest rooms ready to accommodate us for as long as we wanted. I even think I heard my uncle say the word indefinitely. And when my father replied, "Don't worry, we will return to the grandparents' house. They're already old, and you never know." When he said that, my uncle's face changed into a grimace of horrible unease. He took my father to his study to talk. Seriously, this would be another thing I would find out years later. Well, that night, my uncle told her about what he and I had experienced at our grandparents' house. He felt it was unfair for her to expose her children like that. My uncle came out of his office, put his hand on my shoulder, and said to me, "Son, I really tried, but your dad just doesn't listen to reason." The first night my father slept at my grandparents' house, you could feel an unnatural silence. I was terrified, wrapped in my sheets and facing the wall. I don't know what time it started, but in the hallway, where all the guest rooms were, where my sister, my father, and I were, we could hear footsteps. And with the little light that filtered under the door, you could see the shadow making its rounds back and forth. At first, I thought maybe it was my father. But after an hour of listening to them and watching them go by, I knew something was wrong. I fell into a restless sleep. Then I woke up to the sound of someone trying to force the handle of my door. Luckily, both my sister and I installed door stoppers so we could feel a little safer. I remember hiding under the bed and waiting until morning so I could come out. At breakfast, it was obvious that my sister had had as horrible a night as I did, and my father seemed dismayed, although he didn't tell us why. Later, I found out that that night he slept with the door open and watched like Grandpa. Grandpa Black, he would walk naked down the hallway, and every now and then he would stop to give him a smile, a crooked smile. At that point, even the grandparents no longer made me feel safe. Not because they did anything to me or my sister, but because it was clear that house was hiding secrets. That's how a few months passed, with me falling asleep wearing headphones just to cope with the house noises. The footsteps, the banging on the doors, walls, and windows. In August or September, as I returned from school, I saw several police cars and a Red Cross ambulance outside the house. Without hesitation, I ran. When I went in, I realized that a good number of my uncles were already there. They were arguing heatedly with the officers. "How is it possible that you didn't find anyone in the house?" they asked. "I don't know what you want me to say, sir. My guys searched the house from top to bottom and didn't find any signs that anyone had come in here. But my brother told me that person didn't run toward the exit, but toward the rooms. There has to be someone." "Look, sir, we're going to check the house again, and you can come with us to see for yourself that no one is there." My father was devastated, sitting on one of the couches in the living room, staring off into space. I went and sat next to him, and I don't know if it was because of his state. He didn't realize it was me who sat next to him, but he started to talk. "Dad and I were going over some papers here in the living room, when from the back, I saw something running toward us. It was a gaunt, almost skeletal figure, moving silently. I tried to warn my dad, but he just didn't pay any attention. And suddenly, just as I had seen it, that horrifying vision disappeared in the blink of an eye. And then it appeared again, biting your grandfather on the forearm. And then, like an animal, it ran on all fours toward the back of the house. When I heard that, I got so scared that I had to get out of there. In the ambulance, paramedics applied compresses and bandages to Grandpa, and intentionally I asked him, "Grandpa, what happened?" He turned to look at me, clenched his jaw, and finally said, "A drug addict broke into the house. Guadalajara keeps getting worse, and Cosio does nothing." And he was referring to the governor at the time. And at that moment, my sister came up to me and said, "Grandpa was attacked by Grandma Blanca." The paramedics suggested to the family that those wounds needed to be seen by specialist doctors. Also, I don't know how to explain it, but Grandpa didn't look well. He was pale and could barely stand. That day, Grandpa was admitted to a private hospital. In fact, as I remember, he was taken to intensive care. My uncle finally took us and my dad out of my grandparents' house. Although Grandma fought hard to stay, she eventually agreed to leave the house, only while Grandpa got better. Shortly after, I would learn the truth about that night from my uncle, when Grandma ran away to go to her old house. When my uncle gathered all his siblings, including my dad, to go look for her, because they had a good idea of where they were going to find her, they found Grandma dead in a room in the forbidden area. Supposedly, there were some candles arranged in a certain pattern. The cause of death was a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and the grandfather didn't take long to join her, since he died a week later. Grandma's house was abandoned for a long time, and the siblings discussed what to do with it. Finally, it was decided to demolish it and sell only the land. "I don't want to be responsible if whatever is in that house affects someone else," said the oldest of my uncles. "I think the others only cared about how much they get from selling that place." I want to add that right before this house was demolished, a kind of room was found, completely hidden. Until then, the door had been wallpapered over. Its contents, without going too deep into the subject, were not suitable for a Catholic person or someone in their right mind. Several peaceful years passed. After my grandparents died, my father was never able to fend for himself again. Christmas of 1996. I remember sitting with several of my uncles to talk man to man. I wanted to know a few things, and they already knew what I was going to ask. People around here have stories and they give them names, son. Believe me, what I've seen, I don't know what name to give it. You'd do well to remember what happened to those kids in Mazamitla. You didn't get to meet your great-grandmother, and you should thank God for that. Because if that woman wasn't a witch, I swear to God, I don't know what a witch is then. Back then, the family business began to grow, but we had to live in the countryside on great-grandmother's land. Your mom, if you can believe me, didn't have a family. A family friend found her in the forest. Great-grandma called her Diabru, or sometimes daughter of the forest, and she said that by rescuing her, they had made the worst mistake. Since then, there have been accidental deaths in the family, and certainly to me, all of that was superstition. To me, the only witch that existed was great-grandma. And, well, apparently my mom too. And when he finished his story, my uncle just let out a tired laugh. This little story closes a chapter of my experience. However, community, this is not the end of the story, since the rest takes place in more contemporary times. It's interesting to see the family's history in writing. He paraphrases a friend whom I see as such, though he may not feel the same. Everyone thinks their experience has been the worst. After telling my story, I've been asked a lot to share the experience in Mazamitla, and I should add that I already had it written down. But since it was only my perspective, I decided to also ask one of my cousins who experienced it. After 30 years, obviously, memories start to fade. My cousin had the same name as his father, one of my dad's brothers, Joaquin. My uncle was one of the strictest people I've ever known in my life, and he raised his whole family in Mazamitla. Even my dad told me that ever since the grandparents bought the ranch, he moved over there, obviously managing the farmland that the family owns, now managed by my cousin Joaquin. My uncle, though one of those tough countrymen, or at least he gave that impression. He was an extremely superstitious man, and although it sounds contradictory, he seemed to have a kind of mistrust toward religion in general. Any icon or religious poster was strictly forbidden in the hacienda. Perhaps that mistrust was due to the difficult life he had experienced, and not just because he grew up with his great-grandmother, but also because apparently he lost his entire first family in a car accident. Even though he always welcomed all his siblings with a smile and open arms, not so much with the grandparents, he never really talked much about his personal life. Anyway, I'm going on too much, maybe about things that aren't important to the rest of the story. Another thing I didn't know, and that my cousin made me aware of, it's that in Mazamitla there have been local legends for quite some time. Among them is the one about the treasure in the cave of the Sierra del Tigre, which supposedly a Spaniard had hidden, and the one about the witch of Mazamitla. The last one makes me laugh a little, since more than a legend, it seems like people's customs, because in most towns, there are legends about some witch. But anyway, when my cousin told me again what happened, I realized how little I remembered about that occasion, and how terrible that experience really was. So I'll divide the story between what I experienced and then my cousin's perspective. I think that's the clearest way to say it. In a cold and rainy November of '89, my family thought the whole family needed a break, especially after what happened with Raul and my mother's erratic behavior. We didn't know that in just over a month we would be burying her. The family trip started like it does for all big families, with a caravan on the road. And both my father and my uncles looked more excited than certainly my sister, my cousins, and I. The trip was slow and tiring, mostly because of an annoying drizzle that slowed us down. On the way, one of my aunts had a tire blowout and almost went off the road. In the end, she regained control of the vehicle, and the incident was only a scare. I still remember the big caravan stopped on the shoulder, while Grandma kept saying that the whole trip was a terrible idea. She even offered to pay for vacations for all of us wherever we wanted, but she didn't want us to go to Mazamitla. That reaction seemed overdone. I remember standing by the side of the road while Grandma argued with her children, when my cousin Luis, who still used a walker to get around, told me, Grandma seems crazier to me each year. Every time we come to Mazamitla, she acts like this. Although I think this is the first time you all get to see her like this. And you? Why do you think that is? I asked her. She doesn't get along with my Uncle Joaquin. They always argue because my uncle forbids anything even slightly religious in the house. Uncle Joaquin is a good person. I answered him, he is, but... At that moment, I paused for a long time and finally decided not to share what I had been keeping inside. Forget it. Yeah, the guy's a good person. He's just had a tough life. The trip resumed without any major issues until we arrived in Mazamitla. When we arrived at Uncle Joaquin's ranch, Aunt Ophelia and her 3 children were waiting for us to welcome the family. The hacienda, despite having all the comforts of a house in the city, always seemed to me to be a place gloomy, cold. This hacienda, when it was bought, everyone assumed the grandparents would demolish the old building and construct something new. But no. I guess Grandpa thought it was a bad investment, so he decided to remodel it. And, in fact, the building still has that early 20th century mansion architecture to this day. By the way, as far as the family knows, or at least as far as us cousins know, that place didn't have any dark past or anything like that. During the welcome scene was when at least I noticed that something was wrong. There was something strange in the atmosphere. My Uncle Joaquin stood to toast the family's prosperity. Obviously, he did it with a lot of bad words, since he was the most foul-mouthed of all the brothers. But there was also a message for all the cousins. Look, kids, I don't want to see you playing at the end of the estate that borders the forest. I've already told Arturo and Fernando, the foreman, to bring you back here immediately if they see you around there. Even if your parents get mad, I'll still give you a whipping. Since we were kids, the adults didn't tell us why. However, it was my cousin Joaquin who said that bears had been seen roaming around those places. That night, I remember I got up to get some water. Honestly, I don't remember the time, but I could see my uncle talking with his foreman and several men who were carrying weapons and lamps. Without giving it much importance, I went back to my room. When I was passing through the living room to go up to the bedroom they had given us, I clearly heard someone tapping on the window glass, as if they were tapping it with their finger. At that moment, it scared me, but since my uncle was in the central courtyard, I assumed it was one of his men coming to report something to him. The living room window, besides being large, had a type of semi-translucent curtains which were closed, and on the other side, I could only make out a silhouette. That's all. The figure tapped the glass again, more urgently. Yes? I said, growing more nervous. All I got in response was another knock on the window. My uncle is in the yard, I said. Let me in. He answered me with an extremely deep voice while I knocked on the glass even harder. Yes, boy. Let me in. He repeated as the window looked ready to shatter from the blows. I was frozen with fear. I didn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, I was pulled back and fell to the floor. It was my uncle. There goes that son of a gun, he shouted. At the same time, they opened the main door and rushed out with his men. Soon, several distant gunshots were heard. It was my Aunt Ophelia who found me in the living room and she looked nervous. Her eyes were teary. She told me they'd had issues with thieves in recent weeks, and since the police took a long time to arrive, my uncle had made the decision to protect the estate until the police arrived. My cousin later clarified it was mid-October that year, while checking the part of the estate that bordered the forest together with my uncle and Arturo. They saw what seemed to be a naked man, extremely skinny, bald. He was moving strangely as if he were dancing among the trees. He appeared to smile, though he was distant. My cousin said my uncle instantly told Arturo to take him to the ranch house, while he went with Fernando to look for it. He says that after this, they began seeing things, these at the ranch house, especially him and his little sisters. After last night's incident with my uncle, I guess he had to talk to all the adults about what was happening. But everyone continued the family trip as if nothing happened. However, on every outing, I noticed that both my uncle and his men were carrying weapons. In case of bears, I assumed. The next incident happened on the fourth day, when we were coming back from Mazamitla, where we had gone to have breakfast. When we returned to the hacienda, an aunt was having a nervous breakdown. She said that a naked man came out onto the road and stood in front of her truck, and that he was carrying a knife and was approaching her. She ran him over with her truck, and indeed, her truck had a partially shattered windshield. She says she didn't see him fall, and another detail she really emphasized was that this unfortunate man didn't have eyes. That afternoon, my aunt and her family left for a hotel in Mazamitla, saying they'd meet us when we visited the mountain cabins. My cousins confirmed their mom's story to me. Even my cousin said that the man had no eyes and that he smiled as he approached them with his arms open. But there was a different detail in her story. To her, it didn't look like a knife in his hand. She said he was holding a bone. That afternoon at Hacienda was tense, but everyone stayed. They had come to the conclusion that they couldn't abandon their brother. Even Grandpa spoke up and hired a private security company to protect the hacienda, and so that Uncle Joaquin and his family could forget about their worries in the mountains for a while. I remember that the amount of security Grandpa hired was so large. My uncle could even invite his two foremen and their families to the mountains. The last night there, one of the cousins woke everyone up at the ranch with his screams. And it's because, according to him, a naked man crawled out from under his bed, moving like an insect. When he told me about it the first time, Raul inevitably came to my mind. That night, both my sister and I, when we got up because of the scream, we saw someone jump out of one of the second-floor windows. Uncle Joaquin refused to go on the family trip, but in the end, Grandpa convinced him to do it. Joaquin confirmed that the old man told him to move his family out. The men he had hired could use more extreme measures. So I guess Grandpa paid for that security so they would kill that intruder. The day to leave for the cabins arrived. It was one of those very cold and cloudy days at the end of November. All of us cousins got into Uncle Joaquin's truck, and they gave us a huge blanket to cover ourselves, because as we went deeper into the woods, the cold would get worse. We traveled in a caravan again, and in Mazamitla, my aunt joined us, the one who had seen the man without eyes. Overall, the day was going well. All of us cousins were goofing around in the back of the truck, leaving behind the memory of those apparitions at the ranch. We were all having fun except for cousin Joaquin, who was quiet, thoughtful, and whose face showed fear. When we entered the forest path toward the cabins, "Have you seen Joaquin yet?" my sister asked me. "Joaquin, is something wrong?" I asked as I approached him. "Happen? What's going to happen, cousin?" He answered me with a nervous smile. Then he looked back at the trees, at those trees lining the road where Uncle's truck was going at a pretty good speed. I remember I sat down next to my sister again and she covered her face in fear. "What's wrong, Sophia?" I asked her, puzzled by the situation, since all around us our cousins kept chatting happily and laughing out loud. My sister, without uncovering herself, told me, "There's something in the trees." Feeling uneasy, I turned to where Joaquin was looking. At first, I swear I didn't see anything. However, out of nowhere, I saw a human-like shadow sitting on the branches. And as the truck kept moving, it seemed to disappear and reappear, as if it was moving at the same speed as the truck among the trees. When I saw that, I rubbed my eyes to see if it was just tiredness or something like that, but the shadow was still there. At that moment, the truck braked violently, raising a huge cloud of dust, and there was a loud thud. Suddenly, a naked person fell right in the middle of the truck bed, even though that person didn't fall on anyone. The screams came immediately, and there was a good reason for that, because the sight was horrible. The person who fell among us had some tufts of hair and their head looked deformed. They were completely covered in blood and their limbs were twisted. You could see their broken bones in different places. I remember very well that my uncle got out of the driver's cabin and he looked pale and sweaty. "Kids, get out quickly," he said while covering that body with a blanket. My uncle's desperation was clear and understandable. He had run over and probably killed a person. We could already see my other uncle's truck approaching when suddenly two of my cousins let out a horrible scream. The person who had been lying on the blanket, not breathing, just a moment ago, began to writhe horribly. I even remember that he was moving one of his arms as if it were a bloody rattle. When he saw this, and forgetting about us, my uncle grabbed onto the edge of the truck and said to him, "Don't move. Don't move your arm. Help is on the way." At that moment, the person covered in blood let out a kind of horrible guttural laugh, and in one leap stood up. I still remember the unpleasant sound of broken bones colliding. And without stopping laughing, he jumped off the truck bed and disappeared among the trees on the other side of the road, while my uncle ran after that thing, saying that he could help him. I was so disgusted by that image of how that thing's arms moved in such an unnatural way as it ran, that I threw up, and several of my cousins did the same. When it caught up to us, the rest of my uncles and my dad went off to discuss things away from us. However, it seemed logical to me that the trip should end there after this horrible and unusual incident. But in the end, the only thing that was done was to throw away the blood-stained blanket, which now smelled of rot. We cleaned blood from my uncle's truck trunk and window. We were silent for the rest of the way, and I swear to you, I started seeing that figure among the branches of the trees again. When we arrived at the cabins, the staff there told us to be careful because they had seen a large animal in the area. The trucks were stored and families settled into their assigned cabins. That day, we all simply went to bed to sleep. Apparently, that accident had left us all exhausted. At least it did to me. However, at night, a strange sound woke me up. It took me a while to identify it, but without a doubt, it was the sound made by the bones of the person my uncle had run over. When they stood up, the sound could be heard coming and going outside the cabin, as if that thing was running back and forth out there. And then the sound outside my bedroom window stopped, and I started to hear a guttural giggle that seemed to come from under my bed. When I heard, "Little brother, I'm coming for you." That voice was Raul's. This made me get up immediately, and that's when I saw him. A figure leaning against the metal bars of the window. I have to admit that I'm not sure if it was the same person my uncle had run over, but I screamed and ran to my parents' room. In a few minutes, all my uncles and the cabin staff were outside the house, and I hadn't imagined it all because they found fresh footprints around. After they had been searching the area for a while, they finally said that it had just been a bear. However, to reassure the family, the two foremen of the hacienda who were there with their families, as I mentioned, said they would patrol with their rifles. My father closed the curtains in my room and they moved the bed so it wouldn't be next to the window. When I went to bed, my sister came in and asked if she could stay with me. And after that scare I had, I gladly agreed. She got under the sheets and lay down next to me. "Brother, what was outside was the witch that Uncle ran over. I saw her. I went to the bathroom, and when I returned, I saw her pass my window and was petrified at the entrance of the room, and I didn't want to get close to the bed anymore." "Forget that. It was a bear, Sophia," I answered her, trying to convince myself of that story too. "You know very well it wasn't like that, even though that thing didn't have a jaw. I don't know how it spoke. It said, 'The rest of the night I had a restless sleep, full of nightmares, and I remember I dreamed about Raul, but I don't remember exactly what.'" When our grandparents died, my dad became a wreck, to the point that the uncle we were living with, he had to take care of both Sophia and me. I was fed up with all the crap surrounding my family. Raul, the crazy one, my mother, the witch, the damn things from Mazamitla, Grandpa Black, Grandma Blanca, that collection of mummified fingers in the grandparents' secret study. So I buried myself in my studies to the point that when I graduated as a general practitioner, she didn't even attend. Time went by and I was successfully admitted to a specialty program. I used this chance to further distance myself from my family. After completing my specialty, I moved to Monterrey, where I got married and had 3 children. I distanced myself from my family, except for a monthly call to my uncle. I lost touch with Sophia when I finished my specialty. I heard that she had married a wealthy man and had moved to live in Guanajuato. My story continues then in a contemporary time. In 2016, it was December, and once again it rained as if the sky might fall. I remember coming home from work extremely tired and barely making it into the living room. My wife approached me with a worried look on her face. "Sophia called you." When I heard that, I felt like I might faint and had to hold a chair before sitting down slowly. Something bad had happened. I was sure of it. I hadn't spoken to her in years, so why would she call me? I felt a fear as intense as when Raul spoke to me from under the bed. I had an anxiety attack and told my wife that I wasn't interested in answering, that I didn't care about anything related to my family. I went to the kitchen loosening my tie. I was reflecting on how peaceful and happy my life was before that, and that I wasn't going to let some crazy member of my family take that away from me, no matter if this time the crazy one was my sister. "You're her only family," my wife said, hugging me from behind. I noticed she was crying. That cleared up any doubt. Something terrible had happened. My wife handed me a paper with my sister's number on it, and I remember that when I sat down to dial her from my cell phone, it slipped out of my hand several times. She answered on the third ring. The only thing I could say was, "Sophia, it's me." "Brother?" It all started again. He told me. "I don't want to go into details about what happened to my sister. However, I can tell you that her only son had just passed away from an illness very similar to Raul's. I was about to tell her that I didn't go to wakes anymore because I was no longer Catholic. And she explained to me that they didn't even hold a wake for the body, but that he was cremated immediately, and that not even a day had passed when her husband had already left her. The disfigured faces of Raul and Mom came to my mind. And may God forgive me, but I can't blame this man for having left her. Maybe he saw her vulnerability. I told her to come with me at least for a while, and I bought her tickets so she could fly to Monterey. All that night I had nightmares about Raul, about Mom. I saw them making fun of me. The next day, I went to pick up Sophia at the airport, and when I saw her, honestly, I got scared. She looked extremely haggard. She didn't even look younger than me. I didn't want to say anything, but on the way back I broke the silence by asking her, "What happened?" Everything started all over again. "Brother, what happened to Raul happened to my son, and it's been happening to me for a while too." When I heard that, believe me, I wanted to stop the car and ask him to get out and never contact me again. But she was my sister. Besides, this time I was already a man, and a man of science. Maybe I naively thought I could face it this time. We settled my sister in a small guest house. Despite my wife's complaints, who said it was rude not to let her stay in the main house. However, she had 3 children, and I had to protect them. From day one, I swear I heard Raul's muffled laughter. It was like I was 14 years old again when I got up to close the door. Several times I woke my wife, who said I was too obsessed with the past. I think it was December 22nd or 23rd. When I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night, I remember clearly seeing a battered silhouette on the side of my bed. She seemed to be naked and her arms and legs looked twisted. Oh my God, Sophia. I can't recall if I said it or forgot. When I turned on the light, the figure vanished into thin air. I remember my wife even woke up upset and scared. She asked me what was happening, but at that moment, my eldest daughter screamed from her room. I ran to her and entered quickly, hoping to find Sophia there. However, when I turned on the light, only my daughter was there, trembling under the sheets. There was someone in the room, Dad, a figure that was dancing in a very strange way, and it didn't have a head. That's when my wife came in, and as she was coming through the door, we heard footsteps running down the stairs at full speed. Then we heard the living room door open and slam shut. Damn it, I said. Instinctively, I checked on my other 2 children, who were still sleeping peacefully. I woke them up and took them to our room. My oldest daughter and my wife were already there. This is the last straw. I'm going to tell my sister to leave. Nothing unusual happened here before she arrived, I said, very annoyed. And when I was about to leave the room, my wife pulled me back, closed, and locked the door behind me. Are you crazy? Someone clearly broke into the house. I already called the police. And indeed, a few minutes later, the police arrived. We let them in and they searched the whole house with me. There was nothing strange. The house was completely empty, just some questionable footprints in a few areas of the house. We then went to check the guest house to see how Sophia was doing. When we went in, we found Sophia convulsing, and the officers immediately called for an ambulance. After explaining to my wife what was happening, I told her I would feel much more at ease if she and the kids went to her parents' house. Meanwhile, I'd take my sister to the hospital. I admitted her to a private hospital in San Pedro. She was in poor condition, so I recommended she be moved to intensive care right away, where I could keep treating her. The days went by and Sophia began to respond favorably to the medication. As for me, I kept myself busy, ordering every test I could think of. However, I couldn't find any results that would explain what was happening. They all seemed to be a dead end. Things at home calmed down a bit, although I have to say that from time to time I got very anxious when I was alone there. Finally, I requested a study called polysomnography, a study where brain waves are monitored during sleep. When I reviewed the results, something seemed off, but I couldn't tell what. So I showed the studies to a young doctor who was treating my sister at the hospital. "You're joking, right?" He responded with a mocking laugh after carefully reviewing the results. "I know something isn't right, but the result seems nonspecific to me," I told him. "Nonspecific," he repeated in an increasingly mocking tone. "Doctor, you're supposed to know this better than I do," he added. I won't get into technical details, but the doctor explained to me that my sister never reached the level of brain activity associated with deep sleep during the night. He also explained to me which parts of the brain are involved, and that this is usually seen in mental illnesses that are hereditary and fatal. Ensure an autopsy is done when she dies. He told me. Die? Yes, doctor. People with this kind of brain activity during sleep don't have a long life expectancy. Essentially, their body sleeps, but their brain never does. And this causes progressive deterioration that can lead to psychotic episodes until they die. Look into fatal familial insomnia. I had heard about that disease, but it never seemed important to me. And believe me, when I read about it, I was terrified because many of the things that were described seemed similar to Raul's. When I returned home with my sister, my wife forced me to leave her in the main house. She was deteriorating rapidly. Sometimes I found her talking to herself, other times motionless. Again, it was the same thing that had happened with Raul. During that period in January 2017, we sent the kids to stay with their grandparents. I didn't want them to go through the same thing I went through with my brother. I still hadn't talked to my wife about the possibility that I might also be a carrier of a deadly hereditary disease, especially since we already had 3 children who could have it too. The thought of my children in that situation gave me chills. However, those recent discoveries had convinced me that nothing that had happened to me throughout my life was actually something paranormal. Although deep down, I still thought so. That night, I had to respond to a call in the early morning, and when I was on my way back, my wife called me on my cell phone. She was hysterical and was on her way to her parents' house. She had woken up in the middle of the night and saw with her own eyes that headless figure moving in a very strange way in her room. I drove quickly to her. She told me that giggles had woken her up all around the room, that it sounded as if there were many invisible people inside the room. She tried to turn on the night lamp, but it wouldn't work. And it wasn't until her eyes had adjusted to the darkness that she could see that strange figure moving in the room. She ran out of there and swears to me that thing was right on her heels. But when she got in the car, she didn't see it anymore. And Sophia? Where is she? I asked her. Your sister stayed at home, she told me very sadly. But I couldn't blame my wife for not helping my sister leave, especially when I was blaming her for all these paranormal occurrences happening around us. However, this was my sister. She was sick. If something was in the house with her, I had to get her out. I wish I didn't have to do it, but it was my duty. I went back to the house. The gate in the wall was wide open. The house in the back, it looked shrouded in shadows. As I walked down the stone path, I started to feel a terrible chill and a strong wind began to blow. I heard the same laughter as when I was 14. Everything that happened made me recall that moment again. The front door was also open. Sophia, I shouted as I walked in. I felt like the darkness in the back was shifting. That made me pause, and when my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw 2 of those headless figures with hunched backs, long arms and legs, in the living room. Little brother. It was heard from the roof, and when I turned around, I saw Sophia with a smile hanging from one of the chandeliers we had. I ran out of there, but before getting in the car, I called the police again. I found the door open without explanation. They arrived quickly, and after I explained what had happened, they proceeded to search the house again. And once again, we didn't find anything. Only my sister, sick, bedridden, as always. The end of my story, or at least for now, happened in mid-2017. My sister was already very deteriorated and rarely got out of bed anymore. We hired a nurse to care for her. In August, my children and their cousins had a serious car accident, so severe that 2 of my nephews died. My oldest daughter was seriously hurt and needed emergency surgery. I picked up the phone. I talked to my family in Guadalajara about the situation I was going through and that I also needed help so they could be with Sophia. Several cousins said they'd catch the first flight to Monterrey. The night nurse who cared for my sister was absent that day, so I had to visit the hospital to check on my daughter. I had to call that young doctor, who, throughout this time, maybe reluctantly, but with great skill, had been handling my sister's case. When I explained my situation to him, he paused for a long time on the phone and finally answered me. "All right, I'm on my way." I'm not sure what happened. My cousins arrived at 7 a.m. and I told them to go to my house to watch Sophia. Thank God my daughter's surgery went well and she'll recover soon. My other 2 kids had minor bruises. When I got home that night, I found my cousins in the street scared. I ran inside and the house was a mess. That young doctor was sitting next to my sister's bed and she seemed to be sleeping. The doctor had scratches on his face and arms, and it also looked like his nose had bled. "Your family is a bunch of useless people," he said when he saw me come in. He asked about my daughter while gathering his things to leave. The guy had nerves of steel to stay while my family was terrified outside. "By the way, I don't think your sister has much time left. He told me that as we were walking out." "I know," I replied. What happened to me there? It's easily one of the 10 worst experiences I've had. He told me. "Only in the top 10? I joked back too. People always think their story is the worst. He replied, giving me a pat on the back, and then added, "Look, I'm agnostic and I know your sister is sick. However, I wouldn't go near her again without a priest or a rabbi or a monk or something like that. All I can say is that today I saw some interesting things." She still hasn't told me what happened that night and made it clear she never will. I should accept that. My sister died a few days later. I am still alive and I will live forever, with the uncertainty of what took my brother, my mother, and my sister. Maybe it will take me or one of my children.